think just picking up your cue there, Brian, I'm going to come back to you then with a question based on what Jonathan's just said. I mean, you chair something called the Development Assistance Committee, and development assistance effectively is the same as aid. But as we all know, development is about a whole mass of other things besides. It's about trade, it's about remittances, it's about agricultural subsidies, etc., etc., and it is quite a complex set of relationships. To what sort of extent do you think we can sort of move the debate in a different direction? Because I think we all recognise that, 10 or 15 years, aid is going to have diminishing importance. I mean, it already has, but it's going to have diminishing importance over that period of time in terms of the whole relationship between the better off and the less well-developed countries, and we'll move to new types of relationships. So how far are you thinking in your committee about helping that debate along the way?
Well, let me first say that I understand the frustration about the word development. I'm even more frustrated about the word aid, because for me, I think about development in terms of development cooperation, building trust with our partners in the developing world. The word aid is really pejorative for them. It's okay to use aid when someone has suffered a disaster and they need relief. That's aid because they're helpless. In the case of development, of course, what we're doing is helping them help themselves. Is a big difference. I guess I prefer that we use more often the word investment, because to sell what we do in our Western countries, we have to convince people that not only are we providing a humanitarian hand to people who are trying to help themselves, but that we are doing it because it's in our interests to do it. Now, the word aid, it seems to me, feeds our critics, people like Dambisa Moyo and others who have expressed legitimate concern that aid creates dependency, it prevents ingenuity, that it's a gift to salve our conscience, it's a way of promoting northern values and standards, and it's basically a one-dimensional transfer of resources from one country to the other. That isn't what we're doing nowadays. Development cooperation is quite different, and it relates to country ownership and partnership and all of those things that we talked about in Busan. So I'm not sure whether anyone in our countries understands fully how much has been transferred in the last 50 years. We asked our statistical people the other day, how much is that amount? 50 years, 3.7 trillion US dollars. Now, clearly, we have learned a lot in that period of time. A lot of that money was wasted. But if you think about the world today and what it looks like, even despite all the problems, it would be a lot worse place if it hadn't been for that investment that we made. And I think we need to be thinking about development as part of our effort to bring about more stability, more peace, and development. We need to combine these things, and I would include a better environmental future for all of us and a more healthy future, because infectious diseases do not respect sovereignty. That's the way I would make the case. I'm not sure that journalists would listen to me, but audiences like this at ODI, I appreciate what Jonathan Tanner has done here today, would perhaps listen to me. I'm not sure. Thank you.
We all listen to you, Brian. Thank you very much indeed. Okay, that's great. I hope that sets a nice framework within which we can have a discussion. Remember, the discussion is not just about the people in the room. I understand that we're being joined by people from 3 continents. I don't know quite which they are. I can probably guess. But I hope we're going to get 1 or 2 questions online from people as well, as long as someone helps to patch me into those. So let's open it up for questions. If you want to ask one of our panelists or one of our discussants something in particular, tell me who it is you want to address your question to. Otherwise, I will kind of parcel it out. Just say who you are, what your affiliation is if you have one, and ask the question. And by all means, make comments rather than ask questions if you feel comfortable doing that? We've got about 35, 40 minutes or so. Who's going to be first? Yep. Okay, well, there are two up there, so whichever order is...
Hi, my name's Catherine Raw and I work for Save the Children. I was formerly in the media team and I've recently moved over to advocacy, and I just kind of wanted to pick up on, is it Jonathan? Sorry, on some of Jonathan's points. Because a lot of what he was talking about in terms of the language is something that I feel equally frustrated by. And the example that I'd like to kind of talk a little bit about is the way that we kind of use our own terms as a way of protecting ourselves. So the classic example in my opinion is the way that we talk about rape, but we now talk about GBV. And it started off as gender-based violence, and now we've moved on to GBV, and we all know what that means, and we talk about it, and we know what it means, and we know the nuances, and we know that it's not just rape, but it's other things as well. And I think that that's sort of building up a wall between ourselves and the media and other people who don't get that nuance. And I think it's partly for two reasons, and this is something I've observed with country colleagues, is that if your job is to talk about rape on a daily basis, it's really hard to do that, and every time you conjure up that image, it must be awful. And so that I see as a way of them, protecting themselves from having to think about this horrible issue day after day. And then I think we also do it because we feel that we're the intellectuals, so we're protecting out the nuance. So when we talk about GBV, we're saying, no, it's not rape. But that's where we've built up this kind of wall between ourselves and the public and the media, and that's what I think part of the problem is.
Thanks very much. I think perhaps more generally, just before coming to Derek, I'm taking advantage of my position as chair. I mean, I think that's something that happened very much with the social sciences, wasn't it, in the 1960s, 1970s, for those of us old enough to remember that kind of something that ought to have been fairly straightforward. People deliberately created a different language to explain quite simple things because it kind of excluded other people, and that made it special, and it was something academics could then talk about and almost keep other people out of. That's intended to be a provocative remark for the social scientists. So, Derek.
Thanks, Miles. Derek Warren. I work on media and communications for the World Bank, based in London. A few observations really on some of the terminology and other things. I think the first point is that most coverage of development actually goes on in developing countries in the media every day. They don't call it development. They talk about health programs and agricultural programs, new roads, whatever, because it's part of their lives, and that's the basic problem we have here, that it's not relevant to most people's lives. How you go about making it relevant is kind of difficult in current circumstances, I think. The point about coverage, and I'd like to pick up Brian's point about coverage of Busan specifically. I mean, I think if your objective in holding a conference, or one of your primary objectives in holding a conference, is to get Western media specifically, or international media if you like, to pick it up and cover it, then you wouldn't hold it in Busan. I'm sorry, but you wouldn't. Most mainstream media now in the West, if you take that to include America and most of the major European media, the budgets on travel are hugely constrained, and journalists don't travel very far unless they know they've got a major news story defined by their understanding of what's news. And aid effectiveness development is not news, as we know. So if you want to get journalists there, the best thing to do is hold it in Washington or Paris, frankly. If you want coverage in those media markets, it's not going to happen in Busan. A few stringers will go, and as Jonathan pointed out, you'll get people who go wearing several hats, some coverage will come out, but you're not going to get the coverage you're looking for. The other point I think about the way we get coverage of development is that now, for much the same reason, we don't have many foreign-based correspondents who live in developing countries, understand what the issues are, have good contacts, and can pick up stories. We have stringers, again, who report for some of the major media. But if a major event happens, then someone jets in, doesn't know the area, doesn't speak the language, doesn't have any contacts, and tries to cover the issue. So it's not surprising that the coverage is not what people with a development background would hope it would be, because again, it's defined by the news values of the person going in. If you can bear with me for 30 seconds, I'll give you what I think is an excellent example of that. Again, some of those as old as Miles and I will remember West African expulsions almost 30 years ago, where a whole bunch of migrant labourers were expelled, had to cross 2 borders mostly to get back to their country of origin. And it became a media story, including TV media. But it was covered like a disaster, and the reporters covered things like people dying by the roadside as people went back to their country of origin, or hunger. This was a 3 or 4 day trek from memory, and people were taking food and handing it out from the backs of lorries. Not surprisingly, when they arrive with food, just like when you give away freebies anywhere, you get a crush of people trying to grab the stuff. But the fact is that the people who were actually expelled were relatively well-off, healthy people. You know, if you took a group of people here in a particular environment and told them they got to trek for 4 days with all their belongings and their kids and their elderly parents, you know, some people will die on the way if there were sufficient numbers of people. And you'd have to organise food supplies and all kinds of other things in order for them to do that. So the story just was plain wrong, frankly, and the guy got an award for the coverage.
Thanks very much, Derek. Just before I come to one or two other hands up in the room, I just want to let you know that questions and comments are flooding in from all over the world. Well, I've got 3 actually. But so far, you know, this is the afternoon is young. One from Federico Bonaglia, who's at the OECD Development Centre, so sitting in a room very close to you somewhere there, Brian, who says it's a very interesting debate, so he's got my attention. And basically he's saying that agencies are not catching up fast enough on the use of social media. So really picking up a point that 1 or 2 people, James included, have made. And also Sarah Johns from Plan International also says the same thing, basically that citizen media, small media or whatever, you know, has not really been used in the way that it should have done, and has a question, which is what value people believe the citizen media has in increasing the visibility of development. Andrew, maybe that's something you'd like to just have a little crack at?
I'll have a crack at it, yes. I mentioned The Guardian earlier on, and the sort of the niche development site there. And the question that's always uppermost in my mind when I know that that's where we're going with a story is, what impact will it have? How many people will look at it? And I have to say, frankly, with social media as well, that kind of slight scepticism, it possibly reflects the age I am, I don't know. However, what I would say is that when describing the difficulties of placing stories about worthy subjects, such as disaster risk reduction earlier on, what I could have gone on to say was that recognising how difficult it is to get people to show an interest in that, what we did very recently was send a multimedia reporter to the Philippines, who came back, who produced a presentation, if you like, that was about the methods and the measures taken by people living in the shanty towns in Metro Manila, so that they received early warning of flood risks, etc. And that presentation went big on Twitter. It went big on various news websites. So that was an opportunity we spotted to actually try to get people who might not bother to look at a newspaper website but might look at something online to take on board a particular development issue. I know that campaign teams use social networking a great deal. I know that fundraisers use social networking a great deal. I know that Action Aid in Spain, for instance, has set up very recently a system whereby you can contribute to a community in South America and you'll get regular tweets back from the actual community that you're giving assistance to, which replaces the twice-a-year letter that they used to receive. I think it remains to be seen whether that's going to be successful. Have we made as much use of the medium as we could or should? We paid a great deal of attention. We use it every day. As it develops, I hope that we will develop alongside with it.
Great, thanks very much. Ivor. Yep.
Hello, I'm Ivor Gaber. Amongst other things, I teach journalism to aspiring journalists at City University and University of Bedfordshire. Picking up one point, and then I'll just move on to another, I agree with Andrew. I think the problem, everybody I feel is going to social media. The problem with social media is it's very much a conversation amongst those who happen to tune into that particular area of debate. It's valuable, it's important, but in terms of mainstream media in developed countries, I think one has to be in the mainstream media to make an impact. I wanted to make a contribution which I don't think is particularly helpful, but it's an observation based on my work with students. There is, I find, a great enthusiasm to get involved in development journalism amongst aspiring students. They often, when they propose projects, they want to write about development issues, MDGs, or going to developing countries and write projects. The problem is, and they do very good projects, let me say, the problem is they then start facing the real world and they start looking for jobs in development journalism, and I don't need to tell this audience that there aren't too many. So they go one of two ways. They go into general journalism and hopefully their enthusiasm for development trickles through in some way or other, or they go and work for Christian Aid or Save the Children or whatever, doing valuable work, but it's not breaking through. And so it comes down, as many things, as to harsh economics. People aren't employing people to write about development. I wish they were, but that's a really fundamental problem we face.
Actually, that feeds rather nicely into the next kind of online comment I got, which is from Tori, who's a freelance communications advisor. And she says, do you think NGOs or the media are most guilty of continuing to peddle 1980s-style images of helpless, starving, passive populations? How can we move on? Well, the fact is, it's the same people. From what you're saying, it's kind of the people who couldn't quite... But what Ivor, do you have a view of that? Can we just give Ivor back the...
I'm afraid I do, and it's not particularly helpful because having worked in the mainstream media most of my life, mainstream media are very good at what social scientists call socialization. So unfortunately you get very enthusiastic, idealistic young students who graduate to go into journalism. It doesn't take them long to learn the values that they don't want to be ridiculed by the news desk when they put up another development story. So that, that's not particularly helpful. But what I find, that's not particularly encouraging, and the mainstream, I do think there's been a movement. I think it's a bit of a cliche now. It might still be amongst those few and diminishing readers of the Daily Express that only development means disaster or dictators or whatever. I think mainstream, coverage, for example, of the BBC is much broader than that. I think we have much of the media, the quality press broadcasting has moved beyond that. But at the end of the day, one's still dealing with fairly conventional notions of that's not a story, which often comes back. People in a faraway land, I'm quoting Neville Chamberlain here, even before your time, people in a faraway land of which we know little. And we're still struggling against that, but I think that is changing, and I think the quality of people going into journalism as a result of most of them having gone through some form of postgraduate journalism training is better, and there is a better awareness. But I won't say they're swimming against the tide, and I think the tide is turning, but it's still a struggle, as we know. But I think things are moving in the right direction, at least that's the view from where I sit.
And I'm sure it's a direct result of the One World Media Student Partnership Programme, Student Development Programme.
I couldn't agree more. You took the words out of my mouth.
Thank you. One here first, and then I'll come back down here.
Hi, I'm Nessa Tierney. I work at BBC Media Action. I don't want to overload the BBC perspective because I realise we've had a few mentions, but before I worked at Media Action, I worked in BBC News Gathering in the Business and Economics unit. And it occurred to me as I hear everybody speaking that, and I know, when you work for the BBC World Service, that's very different than domestic UK media. But I can safely say that in every single programme we covered development issues, and I can't remember ever anybody in any news meeting, in any morning meeting, ever mentioning the word development. And yet, when we talked about cocoa farmers in Cote d'Ivoire or telecoms takeovers in Kenya. We were talking about development, and I do feel that kind of issues around, inequality, power, all these things that we talk about in development were informing those stories, and journalists always had them at the backs of their minds. And I suppose a question that perhaps we could pose is how the development community can engage more with economics and business journalism and the journalists who write and broadcast about money, because that's a big sector of the media that's growing, and perhaps we don't make those links often enough.
Okay, well, Andrew, you may want to comment on that, but I also just want to feedback one comment from Becky Webb, who is an aspiring filmmaker, no media affiliation, basically talking about sort of mainstream oversaturated stories, but the fact there are niche stories out there, very unreported issues that just don't happen to be flavour of the month or whatever. It seems from the conversation we're having that people have got to get the right kind of byline for things, that you've got to kind of find a niche, but you call it something that is not called development from the sounds of the way we're going.
What I do, responding very quickly to your point, I couldn't agree with you more. And I'll just read you something that was on the Guardian website this morning, written by an African journalist, talking about the second scramble for Africa. He said the big question is whether the second scramble for Africa can contain capital flight and see corporate social responsibility distribute profits back to the communities in which companies operate. Now, those are two areas that Christian Aid looks at very closely and puts effort into trying to find stories in that area to present to mainstream business journalists. What I would say, my one big regret I got at the moment is that we put a heck of a lot of work 2 years ago into a report suggesting that huge commodity trading trades in the US was contributing to forcing up the price of food globally, and it's an incredibly complicated subject, but a very, very important one. And I was really disappointed, therefore, when the BBC World Service Business Desk phoned me up to ask me about it. They gave me about 30 seconds in which they tried to trip me up and tried for me to suggest that futures trading should be basically banned, which clearly would be a nonsense, and then gave the floor to a commodities trader for about 3 minutes. And I just thought that was so old-fashioned. What I would say also as well is that in the Africa context in particular, business is of ever increasing importance. The African middle class is growing the entire time, and they're not going to want to sit and listen to things telling them how appalling the state of their countries is, or the state of their health services is. That may be true, but it's not going to attract you to listeners. What you've got to find is a clever way of mixing the two. If I could just quickly finish by referring to a story which was in the Financial Times earlier this month, Oxfam turning into an investor. Oxfam has gone in for impact investment. It's actually loaning funds to a Mongolian machinery and leasing company in the hope that what comes back can then be reinvested in other small and medium-sized enterprises, which of course are notoriously difficult to attract investment for. And that emphasis on the private sector, I think, is going to shape, to some extent, the way what we call development in this room is covered in the years ahead.
Thank you. I'm going to come to two questions here in the front row, but before that I'm just going to feed back one question to you, Brian, which is I think one would be very interesting to have your comments on, and that's the whole relationship between governance and a free press. Jay Dennis, who's a freelance, basically is asking what responsibility we should have for promoting free media in developing countries as a way of improving governance, or is that a bit too paternalistic? How can we help that process, and what sort of discussion is going on in the DAC about that?
Well, I think it's important to recognize how many countries have become democratic in the last couple of decades, and so they are asking for this kind of assistance. We have a governance network that is a subsidiary body of the DAC that studies these issues. We had a session on the media, and have done a report, a sort of guidance for our agencies as they work. They work obviously with media organizations in this regard, and they have to obviously think about context, but many of these societies are looking for this. This is interesting because it's only fairly recently when aid agencies, if you will, or development agencies, began to get involved in governance work, democratic institutions, including the media. And it was resisted for a long while because it was seen as too political. But what we fixed on was the notion that accountability is an extraordinarily important ingredient if you're going to have a successful development effort in any country, and especially a democratic country. And the media is, of course, very important in that regard, and so a lot of effort and resources are going into helping develop media in these countries. Maybe that's the reason why, by the way, there were so many media from the developing world in Busan. And to go back to the point that was made earlier about why we did this in Busan, I still think that having a conference on effective development in a country that had been a poor country and is now a rich country was nice. But I take the point that if we had done it in London, we would have had more press. Now, our ministerial meeting of the Development Assistance Committee, where we hope that we will have guests from China and India and Brazil and other countries, will be held in London on the 4th and 5th of December. So I hope the journalists will take note. Next, there will be a steering committee meeting of the global partnership that was created in Busan. I think that's very significant as well. That's the broader group of people from partner countries, from the new providers, and from the traditional donors that will be meeting. That's the first meeting of that steering committee, also to be held in London on the 6th of December. I hope the journalists in London will pay some attention to that, if not the mainstream, then at least the bloggers.
Thank you, Brian. I'm sure people will put out the word about those dates. And an interesting note, your predecessor as chair of the DAC, I think, is now vice chair of BBC Media Action, Richard Manning, if I'm not mistaken. Right, 2 questions in the front row here, please. Leanne, have you got the mic?
Mark Harvey, the director of Internews Europe. I think there seems to be an emerging consensus here and online that kind of development, if you're approaching the media, that development kind of needs to be the love that dare not speak its name. And I think a number of us know that very well. I think when way back in 1992, I worked with some of the people in this room to get films on the BBC and on Channel 4 on climate change covered, and I think one of the programs that was taken up the most was called Can Polar Bears Tread Water? And we completely avoided any reference to climate change. And I do think we need a sophisticated strategy when working with media here. I agree with James that actually there are fora, both in the developing world, but not just, where new language is being used, and that is actually creating new opportunities. Jeff Skoll has founded the Skoll Forum for Social Enterprise, and if you go there, you will hear Africans, you will hear Asians talking about not development theory, but models of impact. You will not hear about necessarily growth, but scalability. You'll talk about operational effectiveness and investment, and this is quite often very compatible with the language of business journalists. And I think we need to acknowledge that there is a new language emerging that's operating in parallel with a new set of actors who are investing in aid. Often they've made their wealth through new technologies, Gates, Omidyar, and Skoll. And I think they create opportunities for engagement with the media. The question I've got is, coming back to Andrew's point about a bit of conflict and controversy helps to actually elicit newsroom interest. Isn't there an opportunity with the reality is there is hostility to the aid and development agenda in some parts of the UK press right now. Look at the way the Daily Telegraph is gunning for DFID. Is there not an opportunity there for some really informed debate that again makes this connection, the connection back to the interests of the British and Western populations, and I just wonder whether that is something that we haven't explored enough.
Thanks very much, Mark. And just before moving on, I should say there's a comment in from Tom Berry at Development Initiatives, now based in Bristol, nice new office just like this one, who basically says, endorses this this fact that we all tend to use too much jargon and it's a major barrier, and how can we get away from that? And I think you've given already a very good response to that, Mark. Thanks very much. Question there.
Actually, I'm now echoing what most people have said. My name's Ingrid Stelmacher. I was a journalist. I work in conflict resolution and peace building, but I also sit on the board of IDE, which focuses on water aid, but it's a social enterprise. And we have an issue with the title IDE because it stands for International Development Enterprise, and people often don't know what that is. So I think I appreciate everyone's comments about language. I think it's very difficult to condense for a headline lots of different aspects other than using one word like development. So I think we need to kind of think about that, as everyone has said. But also on the social enterprise side, we use social enterprise in our development. So we have ownership, and I think those kind of stories and re-angling as NGOs the stories that we bring to the media is a real key factor, because as the lady from Action, BBC Action, was saying, that they are good stories, but I think we need to reorient them to a different channel, including social media and perhaps YouTube, because there are audiences, but I think there's a bit of fatigue, and I think it's the retelling aspect I think we need to focus on.
Thanks very much indeed. Jonathan, I'm going to come back to you, and then I've got a question right here in the front row. Just before I do, though, John, I appreciate I didn't allow a follow-up to your question, which is about how we tell the stories better. I mean, just to say that there have been there was a really good debate in the House of Lords last week, for example, which did, go into a lot of the sort of issues that you were describing, which was quite full, and the International Development Select Committee, to which the previous director of ODI and I are special advisors, are doing a huge amount of work over the next year or two, looking at the post-2015 work and how the MDGs and SDGs and all that stuff fit together. So there is a forum there, if we could just encourage people to pick up on that. Jonathan.
Thanks, Miles. Just on Post-2015, I shouldn't miss the opportunity to let people know about www.post2015.org, which is a hub for debate about what should come after the next Millennium Development Goals. Rewinding a little bit, I just wanted to interject on some of the comments around social media, because I detected a note of scepticism / realism about the extent of social media's abilities for us to take our word wider. I think if you choose to see Twitter in particular as a newspaper to which you are the editor, and tweets are headlines, and you decide if you want to read that article by clicking on the link or not, that means that we do have capacity to actually get our information in front of more people. Yes, there is an echo chamber element, but being influential within that echo chamber is also important. But what won't work is if we then allow that social media ability to access people directly to feed them rubbish, and to feed them really difficult to deconstruct conversation. And so we have to think, if there is an opportunity there, it isn't in isolation from the fact that we need to think carefully about how we're communicating our message. But I think that yes, there are limits, but there are also opportunities. People are talking about more looking at business and the role of business, particularly in development stories. Just to mention, for those who aren't aware of it, the Financial Times' This Is Africa magazine are very good on those sorts of stories. They like to take an approach that says Africa is Africa, and we're not going to run anything that suggests Africa is somehow a different place in the world to everywhere else, in that it's a place, which is quite refreshing. And I have a particular question actually for Andrew, and that's to ask whether your idea, I mean, I've mentioned newsrooms being cynical about people writing development stories, but if we listen to what you said, they're not cynical about people writing stories. In your experience as a news editor at a major national newspaper, at that time, what was your idea of a good story that contained development? And as the head of media at Christian Aid, what is your idea of a good story that contains development? Have those two things changed? If so, how? And if not, why? And what's a good story?
Right.
So
Okay.
do you want to answer that straight away, or do you want a minute
Do
to
you
think
mind?
about
No,
it?
do you mind if I
Straight away?
do?
No, fine. Do.
I would say that yes, they haven't. What constitutes a good story hasn't changed. A good story has a villain doing something really bad, and it has somebody who is suffering as a result. And whereas when I was running the Sunday Times Insight team, we were busy sort of chasing people, going back a long time, busy chasing people connected to the the Guinness saga, for instance, and various other financial scandals at that time. What I'm really interested in today is the way that large multinational corporations routinely, annually deprive developing countries of something like $160 billion in tax that they're owed, and that effectively is about 1.5 times the annual aid budget. I'm really interested in finding actual examples of that happening. And those examples are beginning to emerge, and there is traction beginning to build up around that particular subject. And so that, as I mentioned, Glencore earlier was a story which we managed to get significant attention paid to. We were therefore disappointed this week to learn that the European Development Bank, for instance, is now refusing to publish its findings into the tax affairs that it was, not only that it was investigating, but it put out a press release to announce that it was investigating. So it's an uphill struggle. One of the big challenges that I face, a lot of my time at the moment, is spent dealing with libel lawyers. Because when our partners on different continents come to us with stories of malfeasance by companies that might be listed on the UK Stock Exchange, and we want to identify those companies and identify what's happened, we have to guard ourselves against the fact that even if the report never appears in this country, the mere fact that we have paid to have that, or our payments have contributed to the writing of that report, could land up with Christian Aid being found having to answer in front of a British libel court, because this is the libel capital of the world. And it doesn't matter if you're right, the sheer anguish and the long hours and the expense of preparing your case, particularly with the kind of resources I've got in my newsroom at the moment, I have to be extremely careful. And that is a major obstacle.
But maybe, just maybe, before we come on to the next question, the fact that some of those multinationals or other ones are doing precisely the same in this country and are depriving the exchequer of tax receipts because they're setting up, shell companies in tax havens in order to avoid paying taxes. Maybe that makes it a more interesting story.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So, question in the front here. Sorry we've taken so long to get to you.
No problem. My name's Rosa. I work in communications at an NGO called Health Poverty Action. My question is for you, Andrew, and slightly related to what I think Mark was talking about, possibly using the aid debate as a peg to get into the news. And I wondered if you think that could be damaging in a way. There's some evidence recently about the UK public seeing development as only about aid and donations, when obviously that's not the only issue. And do you think it could be damaging if we're trying to peg to that issue when actually there's many other issues, and if no one else knows about the other issues, then in the long term, is it damaging to our overall aim, which is to end poverty?
I think that we have to address the anti-aid debate head on, but at the same time, I don't believe that should completely dominate what we say about the work that we do. I very much want the chance to rebut some of the claims that Ian Birrell, the journalist, for instance, routinely trots out in defence of his attacks on aid, which are beginning to sound, sort of verging on the. I hesitate to use the words hysterical, but there seems to be a real bee in his bonnet about this. it's not an easy one to fight. When the Sunday Telegraph had a crack a few weeks ago, about 3 weeks ago, I phoned them and spoke to somebody there that I knew, and I said, and we were named in one of the pieces as suggesting that DFID was concentrated more on aid and not enough on long-term development. And I said, I'd really like to write you a piece that would set out what we mean by sort of, what long-term thinking should include. Absolute disinterest. They did put the letter that we were offered instead in, but that was it. I don't think that the charges can be allowed to stick. And I personally don't think the debate is going to go away either. In fact, it's likely to heighten.
Just James, I'm going to come to you. Just one more comment coming in online from Jay Wisniewska, who says that an average taxpayer would like to know what's in it for me. There is more and more self-interest, or maybe it's common interest among the public in a donor country. So how do we communicate development in an interdependent world and on complex issues such as governance, migration, trade, etc.? Maybe, Brian, that's something I can come back to you on in a second, after I've gone over to James. How do we convey that complex relationship, which is not just about aid, but it's about trade policies, it's about agricultural subsidies, it may be about arms sales, indeed. It's about that complex web of relationships between developed economies and less developed economies, and how do we capture complexity? And perhaps because we've hardly mentioned them, are the MDGs the right sort of way of trying to do that? And to conclude this kind of conversation, can we aspire to a relatively simple set of goals that journalists and the media are able to communicate fairly straightforwardly? Small question, but James, you first, please.
Can I just say two slightly contradictory things about Busan, which I think reflect on the conversation as a whole? The first thing is, so I work for BBC Media Action. It's a charity attached to the BBC. It's not the same thing. So I can be a little bit critical sometimes of the BBC. Before Busan, we helped with the BBC College of Journalism to actually set up a briefing where two of Brian's colleagues came and gave a presentation in Bush House to BBC journalists about the forthcoming conference. And yet no one from the BBC ended up going, despite those being very good presentations. So is that because Busan is in the wrong place, on the wrong issue, and it's a fundamentally boring issue? Well, Busan was about working out how to spend wisely and effectively billions and billions and billions of pounds of public money. And I don't really understand what the lack of interest is in about the architecture that surrounds the expenditure of a huge volume of public resources. So I don't understand the lack of a journalistic interest in that. And I don't accept the issue about Busan was in the wrong place. I think Busan was a story, as Brian says. Busan was in rubble 40 years ago. And the fact it's one of the most booming ports and cities in the world now is largely thanks to development expenditure. And the fact that Korea is now an exporter, is actually an aid provider, not an aid recipient, is largely thanks to aid. So it was a story in its own right. It's a very intelligent, inspired choice, in my view, of where to have the conference. So I don't think it's great that BBC and so very few others covered that story. It seemed to be quite an important issue. I do think the branding doesn't help. And several people at the thing said the fourth high-level forum on development effectiveness is a very difficult thing to start introducing a news story on the BBC or anywhere else. So finding something else to actually call these things would be really helpful. I do need to just come back on the very good question in which Brian also answered about, and to thank Brian also and the OECD DAC, because I've been quite heavily involved in the governance network and helped to organise the meeting he was referring to on getting media development people together with a lot of the governance people from the bilateral and multilateral agencies. And that meeting took place before Busan. It's very successful, came up with clear recommendations which were fed into the Busan process. But I do need to say the word media does not appear in the Busan Declaration. And I think Brian disagrees with me on this, but I've said this in quite a long blog at the time, is that I think the word media does not appear in the Busan Declaration because there was a desperate need to get China to buy in to the overarching aid effectiveness community. If you put things like support to a free and plural media in there is not going to encourage China to buy into that, which in turn does give you quite a lot of insight into the politics of a future terrain of a politics of aid and development as we go forward, which again seems to me quite an interesting argument to be having at the moment. What are the fundamental values that are underpinning the current development consensus? So there are important issues to be exposed and explored and reported on here which aren't being. And I do think it's not just about getting the stories of life within countries, which is important. It is about actually getting to the guts about how money is spent and why and with what purpose and what effect. And that's, I think there's a level of idleness in journalism and a level of disinterest in development and aid which actually isn't really acceptable. We do need to get better at reporting on these issues, shedding light on them, not always in a hatchet job, but actually just understanding what's going on.
Thank you, James. Brian, I'm going to come back to you and give you a couple of minutes to answer, pick up any of those points and the ones that I asked you earlier on. Over to you, and you're free to say what you like for the next couple of minutes.
Thank you very much. I have to say that on the question of the media covering Busan and BBC's not attending that particular meeting, it's kind of ironic in a way because the BBC and maybe CNN as networks do devote a good deal of time to telling stories that relate to development. And I think it's ironic that in this case they didn't take the bait and see the value of the story. So I agree. I don't think we explicitly excluded reference to the media because of China. There were several references to human rights and democracy in the document, references to parliaments and other things. And it may well be that the idea was introduced a bit late in the game and it wasn't included. It clearly should have been, let me put it that way. But I do think that all of the other references to human rights and democracy somewhat make up for it. On the question of how to convince your taxpayers that this is a good investment, there are many arguments, but the fact of the matter is that the OECD countries' growth rates, I think we're all familiar with. We're not growing demographically nor economically. And I think that that's going to be a trend for a good time to come. We are simply demographically challenged, if you will. And so the growth that's happening in this global economy is happening in the developing countries. In the emerging economies, it's quite clear with the growth rates they're experiencing, but there are tremendous growth rates in Africa, and Africa is projected to have the highest growth rates in the world in the next 10 years. I don't know if people realize this, but Africa doubled in the last 5 years the amount of money it's raising in taxes from its own people to the level of $552 billion last year. That's rather extraordinary, and that kind of number relates to the investment in development that leveraged, that basically we have had a tax and development initiative here at the OECD that I think has been very important as we encourage people to have fair tax systems and ones that are efficient and the like. I think you talked about the complexity. We had a meeting yesterday on policy coherence for development. It is highly complex. I mean, our financial policies, our trade policies, our agricultural subsidies all relate and undercut the investments we're making with official development assistance. We need to get at that. We need to be looking at policies within our countries that contradict our efforts to bring about development in the poorer parts of the world, because we're undercutting not only the investment we're making immediately, we're undercutting our ability to create growth in the global economy, which we can then later take advantage of. The other issue is one of avoidance of expense that comes from paying for security. I mean, it really is rather amazing that the U.S. government spends over $800 billion a year on military, and if you were to add what NATO nations are spending on the military, and you compare that to the combined total of official development assistance of about $130 billion, it's a pittance compared to what it offers for our security, the avoidance of conflict. I don't think people have come to the realization it's a public policy issue of major import, and that's the kind of thing that ought to be covered, if not by journalists who are covering daily stories, at least by editorial writers. Thanks.
Brilliant. Thank you, Brian. Andrew, do you want to say one or two things in conclusion?
A couple of times the question has been raised as to why agencies don't try to sell to the public why aid is a good idea. I know that the two reasons that DFID trots out is that aid helps future trade and helps deter potential future military or terrorist action against British targets. Those aren't lines that Christian Aid would support. We believe that people in need should be given help regardless of race, colour, creed or whatever. What I've done frequently is try to defend aid on the basis that it's the moral thing to do. And by aid I mean development rather than aid. I think it's nobody really quibbles with the idea of providing immediate sort of help to people who have suffered emergencies or disasters. It's the whole area of the development that seems to raise people's hackles. I've tried to defend it on radio stations, etc., by pointing out it costs little more than a penny in the pound. What I would suggest is you need quite a strong constitution to go on to a lunchtime radio talk show in the Welsh Valleys defending aid at this particular time. I felt very much like Custer, I suspect, at the end of that particular hour-long encounter. I think the world is changing. I too teach at City University. I do a specialism in humanitarian reporting, in the full knowledge that most of the students that I'm talking to will be very lucky if they can work in the areas that we're working in. But by the same token, I do think it's important that this idea of how things do connect, how climate change does connect with food security, how food security does connect with conflict, and so on and so on. If you point out to people who are straight out of university or whatever, these connections, at least it holds their interest and at least it gives them something to fall back on should they later find themselves in a position as a mainstream journalist to weigh up the pros and cons of somebody like myself phoning them up. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I think that brings us to the end then. I want to say a particular thank you to Brian, beaming in from Paris there, and Andrew for stepping in at short notice. Very much appreciated, both of you. Thank you, Mary and James, for being discussants. Jonathan, thank you too, and thank you to ODI through you, if we may, for providing this wonderful new venue, which I'm sure we'll all want to come back to. And thank you to One World Media, of course, for co-hosting this and making this an integral part of One World Media Week. In the normal way, this has all been kind of recorded. The video will be online over the next 48 hours or so, and only 2 minutes behind time. Thank you all. Have a nice afternoon.